Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. This video is part 2 of our series on terrain to help celebrate the launch of Team Yankee West Germans. In our last episode, we used the Mechanics Workshop by Battlefront Miniatures and customized it to make some interesting terrain for our West German spread. In this episode, we're going to forge ahead and use the PAH anti-tank helicopter and build a helicopter landing pad. If you haven't seen the previous episode and would like to catch up, because some of the skills build on the earlier video, please check out the link right here. In the last episode, we set up a plan to design the build around, and referring to it, we see that the next step is to build the helicopter pad and, of course, the helicopter to go on it. So, getting out the PAH helicopter, I get to work building it. In one of my earlier videos where I was unboxing the parts for this project, I said that I was probably going to crash the helicopter and build it as a piece of terrain where it had been downed by maybe anti-aircraft fire. But when I saw how nice the model was, I really just couldn't bring myself to it. So instead, I built the helicopter whole and figured I would just put it right on the landing pad. Now that the helicopter was built, I primed it US NATO green, and then followed up by putting a light coat of US Army light green over the top, focusing on the upper surfaces. Then I mixed this 50-50 with sand ivory, and went over it with a final highlight, focusing on the very highest points on the model or where the sun would hit it directly. When this was complete, I then got out my blue-gray and went back and sprayed irregular camouflage patches all over the helicopter to imply a black camouflage scheme. A quick top highlight was now required, so I mixed some dark sand with some US Army light green and took it and dry brushed it very, very lightly over the exterior of the model. Once this was done, as often happens with dry brushing, things come out a little bit chalky, so I poured out some Army Painter military shader and went back and dabbed that on over the top just to smooth out the transitions and add a little bit of depth. After the Army shader had dried, I decided it would be a good idea to put some unit markings on the model, so I put some decals in some water to soak, and I also took out some masking tape and masked off the ends of the main rotors and the tail rotors so I could add some color. After the decals had soaked, I placed them on the model and left them to dry, and then getting out my trusty bottle of Ferrari red paint, went back and sprayed red onto the tips of the main rotor and the tail rotor. I then removed the masking. Moving on to the finer details, I painted the exhaust and the junction of the tail rotor in a dark gray and then highlighted it with a light gray. Now comes the windows. I started with a dark blue and layered it in where the window frames would be, switched out to a medium blue, and mixed a couple successive lighter shades by adding white to it, and then finally getting out blue-gray, I painted in some final glints and dots on the canopy to suggest reflections. The helicopter was now ready for shading, and since I intended to do it with enamels, I gave it a couple layers of satin varnish first to protect the paintwork, and then getting out my enamel dark wash, in this case black for NATO green vehicles, I applied it into the gaps and the crevices. After the enamel had had time to dry, I then got out my gloss varnish and painted it on over the windows of the helicopter. This was the last step on the helicopter itself, So now it was time to move on to the base. Going back to my original plans, I checked out the dimensions of the base, determined that it would be 6 inches deep by 9 inches wide, and went ahead and cut the shape out of foam core. I then took my pen and scored a gridwork into the surface of the foam core that matched the existing gridwork on the mechanic shop, and subtly sculpted in some scratches and chips into the surface to add some visual interest. Going to my bits box, I got out some old drainage grates that I had 3D printed some time ago, and laying them out on the surface of the base itself, ruled out where I wanted them to go. Then I took a sharp knife, cut around the perimeter of each grate, and using a chisel-shaped knife, went in and hollowed out the space on the surface of the base where each grate would be recessed. Once this was done, I took out hot glue and glued each grate into place. It was now time to start adding some color, so I got out some tan paint, dry brushed it over the base, followed up with some light gray, and then finally dry brushed on a really light coat of white. Now came the markings for the helipad, but I didn't have a circle stencil that was big enough, so I took the lid off my trusty jar of Mod Podge and thickly brushed on a whole bunch of red paint on the inside. Then flipping it over and lining it up with the middle of the base itself, I went and stamped it down on the surface. I let it set in for a minute and then removed it. Voila, a perfect red circle for my helicopter to land in. The helipad itself was looking a little Spartan, so I went to my bits box, located a 3D printed pallet I had made a little while before, got out some plastic 55-gallon drums, and even printed off a small windsock. I then took out hot glue and installed these on the base. I painted the drums blue, the pallet brown, and the windsock colors. Matching up the edge of the helicopter pad to the edge of the existing mechanic shop, I then went and took out my brown, beige, and dust-colored pigments and worked them into the surface of the helipad, trying to make it match up with the existing pieces of terrain. Once this was done, I then got out my rust enamels and worked them into the metal areas. I blended them a little bit with white spirits, and then finally taking out dark wash enamel, which is a heavily thinned down enamel paint that's a dark brown, I went and lined in the spaces around the pavers. This pretty much completed the helicopter pad, so as always I went over all my work with a couple coats of matte varnish to take the shine off of any of the materials I had used and to protect it from the inevitable wear and tear of gaming. And with that, this part of the project was done. Despite the fact that this terrain is largely just open space, I think it came out to be very interesting to look at. The interplay of colors and textures from the stone pavers and the rusted metal grates creates a splash of color and adds extra levels of interest, while the helicopter itself goes a long way to help establishing that this location has a purpose. The oil drums and the windsock add a little extra touch, and they help establish that this space is in fact lived in and used by troops or military personnel. That's it for this video, but don't worry, there's still 2 more episodes to go in this series. In the next episode, I'm going to take the Battlefront factory building and convert it into an administrative building for our helicopter landing pad. Thanks for watching, and remember, as always, keep building life in miniature.